also mentioned on there.
We're going to go ahead and get started. Mr. Aiken is on his way, and Dr. Zelikow, I think, is either finding his parking place or has found it and is being escorted up, but he was scheduled to be our fourth testifier, and I suspect has read your all's opening statements, your written statements. We welcome you all today to the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations hearing. This is our second hearing in a series of hearings we're having on, we call it, I guess, grand strategy, new grand strategy, whether we need a new grand strategy. Chairman Skelton has expressed his support for the subcommittee's work and intends to hold a hearing in the fall at the full committee level with former secretaries of Defense and State. At our first subcommittee hearing on July 15th, the witnesses agreed that our two, perhaps our two most important national security challenges were actually ones we need to look at internally to regain our fiscal health and, as soon as possible, to have a sound and comprehensive energy policy. While focusing on these two issues, there also was agreement amongst our witnesses that there is no clear-cut existential threat to our nation. And while these witnesses emphasize the importance of rebuilding the foundation of this country's power as the basis for its grand strategy, they also caution that the world is too uncertain a place for the United States to somehow declare a timeout while we work on things like energy policy and our fiscal health. And also everyone was in agreement we need to pay better attention to engaging our allies. I appreciate you all being here today. I've read your written statements. What we will do is we will turn on our little light here, and it will start flashing red at 5 minutes, but that's more just to give you a sense of where you're at with time, and if you need to go on past that to finish your statement, I would encourage you to do that. Obviously, some of you have written statements. If you actually read the whole thing, we'd be here till Tuesday, and I don't intend to be here till next Tuesday, so I would hope you will give a more condensed version. But Mr. Aiken is not here. When he comes here, we'll give him an opportunity to make any comments he wants to make. And we'll go ahead, Admiral Blair, and begin with you. We're pleased today to have as our witnesses Admiral Dennis Blair, Ambassador Robert Hunter, Major General Robert Scales, both Admiral Blair and Major General Scales are retired, and then Dr. Philip Zelikow will be joining us. I'm sorry.
Just did.
Oh, Dr. Zelikow is here with us. So great, Dr. Zelikow. Thank you for being here. So, Admiral Blair, let's begin with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I read over the transcript of your last hearing, and I agree with the thrust of most of your witnesses that probably a tight, clever, sophisticated strategy is not something that's possible for the United States, a tight, possible grand strategy for all of the reasons you discussed earlier. But I do think that we can have a set of strategic priorities and approach to the way the United States uses its power in the world. I would say that because we can't really have a tight, clever, integrated strategy, we probably need a little more power than would otherwise be the case. If you look at North Korea, for example, and our interaction with them over the last 20 years, they've had an amazing strategy and no power. We've had an amazing amount of power, very little strategy, and the result over 20 years has been about a tie. So the United States sort of needs some extra power if it's going to operate in the somewhat open way that we do. And so I very much share the views of those at your last hearing that we need to work on the internal basics so that we have this power. And it's not only economic and fiscal power. We need to regain some of the moral authority that plays so powerfully for us in the world. So if we are to have a set of strategic principles, if not a strategy, what should we start with? And I believe we should start with the objective that we seek. And I think that's fairly simple to state. The United States seeks a world in the future in which there are nation states which have secure borders. These countries can enforce the rule of law within their borders. The governments of these countries are representative governments, representative of the will of their people. They have basically market-based economies, and they trade with one another. I think that's the kind of world we're looking for. So that should be at the heart of our strategic principles. I think if you look at that end state, that vision, most of the rest of the world would share it. You notice that it doesn't mean implanting American-style democracy in other countries, but if you go a level down, I find that if you talked with citizens of other countries in terms of these more basic principles, rule of law, representative government, secure borders, and so on, you find quite general agreement. So if we phrase it in a way that translates well in other countries, I think our objective we'll find is shared by most of the world that we care about, and that provides a solid basis for our strategic principles. So strategy 101, objective, where you are now, how do you get there? What are the strategic principles that we should follow as we try to work towards that world? Number one, I think we should use the unique power that the United States has, that we've enjoyed ever since the end of the Cold War, to build norms of international behavior, institutions, precedents that favor that sort of world that we seek and that I think others seek if we communicate with them correctly. This has two components to it. Number one, when there's not some crisis going on that absorbs all of our attention, we should work on capacity. That's capacity within other countries. That's capacity of international institutions. This is the sort of nuggy, day-to-day work of attending meetings, building institutions, educating others in the United States, helping non-governmental organizations to build capacity for rule of law, legal systems, democratic representative institutions in other countries. And we should put a strong focus on that on a day-to-day basis. When it comes to handling a crisis, handling a particular situation, I think we should give a strong preference to collective action. The United States may lead it. The United States may not. There may be times when we have to act unilaterally, but our strong preference should be for collective action towards these common goods, which I think we all share. This is not just pie in the sky. When I was in the Pacific Command and dealing with Indonesia, when we were both dealing with the East Timor issue, in which there was an Australian-led operation, and in the tsunami relief, in which there was a big multilateral relief organization, the United States worked together with other countries. The result was that we rebuilt very strong relationships with Indonesia, a very important country in that part of the world. So I think that these principles can work. Principle number two, and I know it's also of interest to this committee, is integrating the forms of national power. And that means not only across the government, state, defense, intelligence community, but also with the private sector, both the non-governmental organizations and with the for-profit commercial sector, international companies, and so on. I think if we follow those two principles, if we keep our eye on that vision of where we want the world to go, we can hand on a world to our children and grandchildren in which they can be free, secure, and lead fulfilling lives. And that, after all, is the objective of our strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Blair. If Admiral Hunter, we've been joined by Mr. Aiken. Let me give Mr. Aiken time to make any opening comments he would like to make.
I'm just interested in anything that's grand, and appreciated your comments, looking for more, and welcome General Scales too, and good to see you again.
You too, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, Mr. Aiken. Ambassador Hunter, we'll recognize you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, let me compliment you and the subcommittee for doing this. You know, we have gone now twice the time that we fought World War II since 9/11, and we still haven't developed a new grand strategy. And the initiative you're taking right now, I think, points us in the right direction. Remarkably, listening to my colleague here, I agree with every word he said, plus what you summarized from the last hearing. We are now building this on a bipartisan basis, and I think that is going to be critical for the next administration and for the next Congress. In fact, what you're starting today, I encourage you to continue it, to pair also with the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I do believe here in the Congress, while you appropriate and authorize in a certain mechanism, it would be very useful if you had some committees that would look at the grand strategic picture and everything together to help give guidance to the administration, because quite frankly, the barriers between administration and Congress have to fall in this area. We're all in this together, and that's the only way I think it's going to work. Just to summarize very briefly, I think there are a number of areas. One is in strategic thinking. You're already initiating that. Secondly, as you mentioned, strength at home. A whole series of areas, and not just energy and fiscal soundness, but things like health and education, the strength of our people, infrastructure, and yes, our reputation, and what the world wants to look at the United States, even though it sometimes sounds like a hackneyed phrase, as a city on the hill. I think we're moving in that way. We also have to have, as you well know, popular support of the American people. I've long believed that any president who has a policy cannot sell to the Congress and the American people doesn't have a foreign policy. That is an absolute requirement. In terms of tasks and priorities, I think we know some of the near-term ones: terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, the places where American fighting men and women are at risk today, in Iraq and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, with a major element of Pakistan involved in that. The Middle East, where we are going to be preoccupied for the indefinite future. But I want to raise the question whether we need to find a way to depreciate the amount of time and effort we have to put into the Middle East, when there are others who might be able to do it with us, and things we may be able to build for the future, so that we can get on as well with some of the critical things that are happening in the world, and particularly in the Far East, China, and the new emerging issue of Russia. And of course, we have to do an awful lot with the global economy. And then there are three long-term issues: resource scarcity, particularly oil, the environment, and global warming, but have a real problem, and that these, for every leadership in every country, are beyond the political horizon of action. We're going to have to find a way, and you're leading on this, to collapse that. Tools. I agree entirely with what the Admiral said. We need to be looking for force multipliers, power and influence multipliers, and security multipliers, and particularly the integration of instruments of power and influence. We've just finished a project at the RAND Corporation with the American Academy of Diplomacy that will be out a couple of weeks from now, fully consistent with what Secretary of Defense Gates has been trying to do. In fact, there's a new report mentioned in the Washington Post this morning. It is to deal with this extraordinary phenomenon of asymmetrical warfare, which is going to preoccupy us for the foreseeable future. We need to have engagement in the outside world on a government-wide basis, not just the military, not just the State Department. In Afghanistan today, there are exactly 3 employees of the United States Department of Agriculture. That's nonsense. We need to have purple-suited civilians like under Goldwater Nichols. We need to have culturally sensitive people. We need a national security budget, even if it's not actionable, put up by the administration and by GAO, CBO, and CRS here. And we're going to need to shift resources. The ratio between the 050 account and the 150 account right now is 17.5 to 1. The people who will tell you we need to shift resources are the military people who had to do things in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and in Afghanistan. Now, allies, the Admiral's already mentioned that. We are going to need allies elsewhere. And in fact, we're going to have to put the NATO allies on greater notice of their responsibility along with us to do things like in Afghanistan. They've got to pull their weight more, not just militarily, but also non-militarily. We're also going to have to demonstrate to the Europeans that we continue to care about their security. And one thing I worry about is a further reduction of U.S. troops in Europe. That's going to cost us a lot in influence and not save much money. A lot of things we have to do together. I think we have to have a new U.S.-European Union strategic partnership in health, education, a whole series of things, and to break down the barriers between the EU and NATO. Final word on the Middle East. We have an awful lot we have to do, and we have to do it all together. Not just Afghanistan and Pakistan by itself, and Iraq by itself, Iran and the Arab-Israeli, but all together. And 3 big points. 1, as we reduce our position in Iraq, we have to do it in a way in which the world will know we are still a critical Middle East power, and our reputation for power and influence is intact. Secondly, we need to work out a relationship with Iran, and I believe the first thing we should do is finally offer them a deal. You behave, we'll give you security guarantees. We already did that with North Korea. Maybe they'll say no. At least we will have tried, because we're going to be there and they're going to be there. We're going to be the big power no matter what happens. They're going to be a minor power. Final thing, in addition to Arab-Israeli, we need to create a new security framework for the Middle East that will in time enable us to take a bit of a step back, bit more over the horizon while everybody knows the United States, as elsewhere, will continue to be the security provider of last resort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. General Scales.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a military historian, and so my view of a future grand strategy will really reflect more my academic than my military background. I'd like to just, in the 5 minutes I have, make a couple of quick points, and then what I'd like to do at the end is offer some suggestions from a military perspective of what the military services need to do over the next generation or so to ensure that that we meet the needs of this strategy. I think that one of the conclusions that have come out of the last 7 years is that we, as a nation, can no longer go it alone and carry the burden of global security on our shoulders. We can't do it. In Iraq, I think that we're beginning to see where the number of soldiers and Marines available to carry that burden is diminishing in proportion to the size of the mission. It seems to me that we, in the future, in the distant future, as a goal, we need to return to a more traditional supporting role in our partnership to defeat global threats. And I think I view this as a generational effort. It's not anything you're going to solve in the next year's budget, but what I suggest in my statement for the record is over time we need to relook at our coalition and alliance building and build what I call a coalition of enlightened states. The ability to pursue a global strategy led by regional governments rather than led by the United States. We still need, I believe, to protect ourselves against radicalism by protecting the traditional state system. But we need to move away from this cycle of seemingly perpetual violence. And I believe, frankly, that if we treat this as a generational effort, the time is on our side because all radical movements contain the seeds of their own destruction. As they become more radical and they feed on more and more violence, then the revulsion among enlightened states begins to increase. You reach a tipping point, and these things tend to burn out over time. Clearly, we need capability for direct confrontation. This is enemies that happen to arm themselves with nuclear weapons, but I strongly believe that containment and prevention are better than direct confrontation. Still, in this new era of coalition of enlightened states, many of the basic Cold War instruments are still useful: collective defense, regional alliances, economic developments, and so forth. We have to move away from short-term preemptive action to a more patient, nuanced, and longer-term policy of reinforcing our allies. An alliance of enlightened states built over time should be more expansive and more global than the Cold War alliances like NATO. One of the things that's important is to cast a much broader net and build alliances around around nations that have common interests and nations that are fearful of radicalism. We need to have a focus to reinforce statism rather than policies that take apart statism. And there are really three purposes. One, obviously, is education and economic development. Probably the most important, Mr. Chairman, is a strategy focused around defeating insurgencies early. Pre-insurgencies, a policy, a strategy that focuses on pre-insurgency rather than counterinsurgency pays far more dividends in the long term. And of course, we still have to remain powerful to defeat conventional threats. A couple of quick words about how tomorrow's military needs to reshape itself in order to support this coalition of enlightened states. I believe it has to be built around embassies and this country team alliance rather than simply reinforcing combatant commands with military power. Centered around that, of course, it's principally or overwhelmingly an Army and Marine Corps mission to focus on the advise, train, and assist functions. It's also interesting to note that we do this better than any other country in the world. We have a long tradition of success in places like Greece, Korea, Vietnam, El Salvador, and now in Iraq and Afghanistan. I draw your attention to the Lodge Act in 1950, which was an act that brought in aliens from Eastern Europe. And there was a point in the 1950s and early 60s where the entire 10th Special Forces Group was made up of immigrants who were brought in from Eastern Europe and and put into uniform, serve 5 years honorably, and if they served 5 years, they and their families were automatically fast-tracked to full citizenship. What a huge difference that made in winning the Cold War, and not many people know about it. You need to look at something like a universal foreign area officers, not have a specialty, but build foreign area specialties into the entire officer corps, because this can't be a small part of the military if we're going to build these alliances. And the final point I'll leave with you is the challenge of building a coalition of enlightened states is that it's a human rather than a technological or material type. It's a policy built around the human element rather than the technological element of war. War is a thinking man's game, and if we're going to build a new generation of officers, and I would argue senior NCOs who are particularly good at training, assisting, and advising this new alliance, then we have to start educating them from the very beginning of their commissioning all the way through senior service. We'll know we're successful sometime many years in the future when a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff served a great deal of his career as a foreign area officer as well as an operator. Thank you.
Thank you, General Scales. Dr. Zelikow.
Mr. Chairman, I'm a historian, but I've also been a trial and appellate lawyer, and I've served in government in 7 different federal agencies, 1 state agency, and as an elected member of a town school board. So my experience with these kinds of issues of strategy is eclectic, both in domestic and foreign policy. We Americans are really at an extraordinary moment in world history where we have an opportunity to reflect on what our purposes are in the world. I'm glad the committee is holding this set of hearings. Our country, because of its separated and overlapping powers, generally has problems with concerted action, except when a common sense of purpose draws us together. Such a sense of purpose transcends party. It actually sets the framework within which the parties argue. There have only been a handful of these sort of big P policies in the history of the United States. One of the earliest was no entangling alliances. The latest was containment plus deterrence. We have not had such a large common sense of purpose since the end of the Cold War. Since 1991, the United States has brought to a bewildered, confused, globalizing world a bewildering, confusing melange of policy ideas. Politicians and officials talk about terror, democracy, proliferation, trade, the environment, growth, and dozens of other topics. They strike 100 notes, but there is no melody. There are already many arguments about how the United States should try to manage the post-Cold War world. They tend to take current issue sets as a given and focus on how we can handle them better, smarter, stronger. We should use more military, we should have less military, more diplomacy, better diplomacy, and so on. I've worked on a number of these proposals, including on the intelligence establishment, and would be glad to discuss specific ideas. But I urge the committee to dig more deeply into the core problem, which is, I think, a lack of clarity about the problem itself, lack of clarity about what is special about this moment in world history, and what role does that then create for the United States in defining a broad sense of purpose. My argument is that the greatest challenge today, and it's one that's not just evident to wonks, it's evident to ordinary people in the United States and all over the world, is the tension between globalization and self-determination. Globalization versus self-determination. Globalization is a familiar concept, and I don't need to elaborate it to the committee. Self-determination is familiar too. What may be less familiar, though, is a point that a number of world historians have made, is that actually globalization and self-determination are 2 sides of the same coin. They are as connected as summer heat and thunderstorms. Indeed, the term self-determination doesn't exist before about the middle of the 19th century, when you see a lot of phenomena in which people basically are buffeted by global forces, ideas, culture, new ways of doing business, that are affecting the way they're used to organizing their societies, and then they react to that with defiant assertions of self-determination, often with extreme violence, which convulsed much of the world during the middle of the 19th century and then led to repeated convulsions in the 20th century. In this era of unprecedented levels of globalization, we are going through this phase again. Actually, I think it's most reminiscent of the period about 100 years ago. It even includes the element of nihilistic transnational terrorists who frighten all civilized people. Back then, they were anarchists, and they would throw bombs in opera houses instead of subway stations. Globalization versus self-determination is the combustion engine that is now driving debates not only in our country, but in China, Pakistan, Iran, India, Brazil. The issue is, will countries trust that interdependence will work, that the global forces can be mastered to their benefit, or will they start fortifying themselves in 100 ways, listening avidly to the ideologues who will tell them why they have no other choice? In other words, Mr. Chairman, we have now unleashed global forces in a variety of ways, energy, ideas, commerce, that are without precedent in the history of mankind. The forces are unprecedented, but men and women are still being made in about the same size they've been made in for a long time. And the fundamental issue that people are having is, can our communities grapple with these forces? Can we manage this in some constructive way? Or, because we can't manage them, we need to ford up in fear with a variety of ways in which we defiantly assert how our communities will protect themselves against all these different things, incoming people, incoming ideas, incoming capital, in a variety of forms. The agenda that then flows from that, which I elaborate further in my prepared statement, is an agenda that calls for an open, civilized world. A frank discussion of the principles that animate an open, civilized world, and I offer a suggestive outline, and an agenda in which you're basically saying to people, we can develop global frameworks for about 5 or 6 of these forces that look like they're credibly capable of starting to manage them and reassure you. And these frameworks need to be loose enough to allow communities to still feel we can determine our own identities our own way, but these enormous forces, the diffusion of ultra-hazardous technologies, the consumption of energy, arable land, clean water, and unprecedented rates are more or less being managed so that we have a safe framework in which our communities can define our identities the way we want in a healthy way. Or else what we'll see is self-determination will take on the kind of toxic forms that then characterize most of the 20th century. That's the kind of danger that I think we need to avert, and that's the focus of the grand strategy I propose to the committee.
Thank you all for your both your written and your oral statement. Your written statements will be made a part of the record. I also want to let our committee members know this is our second hearing. Our first hearing, we had folks who through most of their career have been affiliated with kind of the think tank aspects of things. Our panel today are for folks who either through their career in the military or in government service have been practitioners of the art of looking at strategies and the implementation of strategies. I also want to acknowledge we have some guests here today, some legislators both from Kenya and from Macedonia that I met with here briefly this morning. We welcome you. I understand you'll have to be leaving sometime during our hearing. We appreciate your attendance today. You go ahead and start the clock here. I wanted to just ask some specific questions from several of you. Admiral Blair, and you make one very specific, of course, we're talking grand strategy, and I'm going to ask some very specific questions about comments you make. You mentioned language skills as being important. General Scales, you mentioned it too, and in fact, I think General Scales, I was going to quote a couple of your comments. You specifically in your written statement say, quote, talking about military officers, no officer should be allowed beyond the grade of lieutenant colonel without demonstrating a working knowledge of a language spoken in a region potentially threatening to the interests of the United States. And then on page 12 you say, quote, cultural awareness and the ability to build ties of trust will offer protection to our troops more effectively than body armor. And that's your statement, General Scales. That's one of those issues that this subcommittee is working on. The obvious statement is that the military and the diplomatic corps inherits the language skill deficit that we as a nation have. And in fact, then we expect the military and the diplomatic corps to solve this problem for us, to somehow fill in your ranks, even though we don't have very deep language skills within our country. At least we're not accessing those, perhaps, that we do. Do either of you or any of the four of you have any further comments to amplify on this issue of language skills and cultural appreciation? Let's start with you, Admiral Blair. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I think there are two aspects to it. I would, more than language skills, I would say regional studies or cultural studies. I find that if an officer, particularly a senior officer, has studied one different country culture in depth, he or she knows that one pretty well, but more important, he knows that you need that sort of awareness. So if I found when I was dealing with a country that I didn't perhaps know a great deal about, I knew enough to get somebody who did. And then, so whenever there was a difficult issue with one of the 41 countries in my area of responsibility, I would get the right people to do it. And that you could find them in many sources. Some of them had uniforms on, some of them didn't. They were out there. So I would agree that we need this for. I think diplomats get it naturally. Intelligence officers should have it. They shouldn't just be technical experts. Military officers, I agree with General Scales. It should be a required part of their education, and so that they know who the right people are to pull on when it's time to deal with another country, another culture in a sophisticated way.
Mr. Chairman, I guess the phrase I've used in some of the stuff I've written before, I call it sort of the cultural right stuff. You know, it's hard to put a finger on it. It could be language, but there are other things, and I agree with Admiral Blair on this. There's certain personal attributes that make people really good at this. Sublimation of ego is one thing. The ability to be collegial and convivial when dealing with alien cultures. I think the poster child that we all refer to in this business is Carl Eichenberry. I mean, here's a guy that speaks fluent Mandarin. He's married to his wife is Chinese. He was the defense attaché in Beijing. And where was he sent to be most effective? Afghanistan. And my point is that he was effective there. He was so effective there, not because there were a lot of Afghans who spoke Mandarin, but because he just had this certain nature about him that allowed people to trust him. And I'm not saying we should have a military occupational specialty called trust, but we ought to at least be able to go through the officer, and I would argue senior NCO Corps, and find those who have these unique abilities, this cultural awareness, this right stuff, if you will, and then build on it over time. I believe that there's actually ways now, talking to some of my social science friends, when you can actually give folks instruments that will allow you to determine whether or not they have this. Think of it sort of a cultural Myers-Briggs that will allow you to determine whether or not people are built for this sort of thing. And I think that's. As we look to the future, if we're going to build these new coalitions from scratch, many of them, we have to find the right people to do the job.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, I have a little personal experience with this. You see, the Air Force tried to teach my son Arabic as a cryptolinguist, and he's now actually majoring in Japanese and will be taking off for Japan in a couple of months. My daughter is spending her whole summer reinforcing her classics training by studying Latin, which I'm afraid is not of very much use to the national security establishment. What comes out of my experience, though, just with my own family, is just two prescriptive suggestions. First is, because the overarching comment is, you actually have a lot of Americans who understand that we're in a globalized world, and I think you'll see general trends of interest in foreign language education, broadly speaking, on the upswing. But I think the two suggestions are, you'll need to incentivize people studying the languages you want. I think you don't need to incentivize people to take an interest in the world. I think by a lot of measurements, junior year abroad, things like that, those are on the upswing. But you'll need to incentivize studies, say, of Dari or Pashto, things like that. The second is, you'll then, if in the best case, you'll have a larger quotient of people in the general population who have language skills you may need in a crisis, but you won't know which languages you'll need. That triple underscores the value of investment in a civilian reserve corps idea. So that you essentially create basic training for cadres whom you need to call upon when you wish to surge certain skills, in this case language skills. It's a precedent the military understands very well for a variety of kinds of skill sets, including language skills, and I think we just need to carry that over into the civilian sector in a way that allows us to tap what I think will be a larger and larger residual quotient of people whom, properly incentivized, can meet our needs.
Thank you. One comment, and then we'll go to Mr. Aiken. Consistent with you, General Scales, we had someone testify here a couple of weeks ago that just because you might find somebody, an American, perhaps a naturalized American, perhaps somebody raised in, say, a Farsi-speaking home, don't assume then that that means they automatically have the cultural sensitivity
Exactly.
and the kind of people, just because
Exactly.
they have that.
That's right.
Let me go to Mr. Aiken, Ambassador Hunter, if you don't mind, since I've already overstepped my time. Mr. Aiken, and I'll give you time, Mr. Ambassador Hunter, when I go around.
Well, first of all, to our panel of witnesses, I think you guys have about hit the ball out of the park. Maybe that's just because I agree with all four of you, and I didn't as much in the previous panel of witnesses, but it seems to me that you've raised some of the key questions and have defined things very clearly in terms of, and it's a common sense kind of thing. I mean, I think if you took your testimony combined and ran it past Americans, you'd get an 80+% buy-off by most people, just common sense. I've got one sort of a technical, how do you handle this question? And then I've got one sort of halfway answer question. The first is, when you've got potentially very unstable nation states that have a supply of oil or something else valuable, where they can develop weapons that are extremely dangerous and toxic to civilization in general, what do you think of this expanded Monroe Doctrine, and do we have to work on a preemptive basis? Certainly all of the things you've said are good to be doing, the containment and the kind of sowing the seeds that are going to produce stable civilizations, but how do you respond to that idea of the preemptive strike in situations like North Korea, but just in general? First, that's theoretic, so let's do that question first. Anybody who wants to take a shot at it? Doesn't surprise me, you all have your hands up.
You call. Let me just say one word about it. Any nation, let's talk about our nation, if it is about to be attacked or has an imminent sense of attack, is going to do what it has to do to preempt. The problem is talking about it in advance. It's the kind of thing you keep your mouth shut about. When the president, to be blunt about it, gave his speech at West Point a few years ago, I said I wish he hadn't given that speech, because we know we're going to have to do it, but unfortunately it displeases your friends and it doesn't confound your enemies. So keeping the capacity to do things, trying alternatives, building allies and that sort of thing, can put the bad guys on notice that we will be there to do what we have to do. And there are a lot of examples in Korea and in Saddam Hussein in 1990 of people miscalculating what the United States will do. Final analysis will do it.
I have a kind of a different view. Actually, in those cases of miscalculation, they miscalculated thinking we wouldn't do anything, precisely because we weren't clear enough about what we would do, or actually we had decided to do something different. In the case of South Korea, we'd actually decided we would not defend South Korea. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had made a considered decision to that effect and had decided to pull our troops out of South Korea, and the enemy read that. Frankly, I don't think there's as huge a difference between Democrats and Republicans on this issue of prevention as you might sometimes hear. If you read Barack Obama's essay in Foreign Affairs last year, he talks about the issue of preemption in terms almost identical to the Bush administration, and is clearly saying it publicly because he wants to reverse the burden of proof a little bit and put people on notice, because it does complicate their planning. What they would say is the big difference from the Bush administration is they use the term imminent.
Right.
And they stress that term. But I urge you to think about that for a little bit. Here's an easy question. In August 2001, before the 9/11 attack, was the threat from al-Qaeda sanctuaries in Afghanistan imminent to the United States? My answer to that question is yes, even though we had no tactical warning about the particular attack they were about to launch at that stage. We'd been on notice that they were getting ready to attack us because they'd already attacked us twice. And at that point, in my view, that's an imminent threat. Now, if someone else would say, no, that's not an imminent threat, then you are in the mode of waiting to be hit hard enough to react. But my standard of imminence is once you see the threat is masked and is clearly poised and aimed at you, I believe that that would satisfy this very subjective criterion of imminence. Because that word aside, I think we're dealing with a doctrine now in which actually the parties have converged more than one might think.
Thank you. I don't know that I'm going to have time, Doctor, to go to this sort of question-answer, but it seemed to me that when we talk about a grand strategy, to a degree it assumes that we have some overarching definition of who we are as a nation and what we believe. And it seems to me that that was defined when we got in our first war as a nation, in a sense, in our Declaration of Independence. And it was stated maybe too eloquently, we hold these truths to be self-evident, etc. But the formula is pretty straightforward. First of all, we believe that there is a God. Second of all, that God gives every human being certain basic fundamental rights. And third, the job of the government is to protect those rights. I was amused a year ago when the King of Jordan, who's Muslim, came here and said to the members' prayer breakfast, this is what we got in common. I believe there's a God that gives basic rights to people, and the government should protect those rights. That was followed a week later by Senator Lieberman giving a 15-minute eloquent talk at the National Prayer Breakfast saying, I believe that there's a God and that he gives basic rights to people and government should protect those rights. I'm not sure that that's a hard thing to sell as much as Europeans hate the word God perhaps, but I'm not sure that that's not a bad formula that our founders came up with to package a grand strategy. It seems like everything you've said fits under that umbrella pretty easily.
Mr. Chairman, I think you have to be a little bit careful about the terms in which you translate those basic concepts. There are over 1 billion Chinese, and I doubt if many of them would agree that God is the source of the government's responsibilities to its people. I think that if you scratched most Chinese down below any sort of ideological surface, you'd find that the goals are the same. But I think that we'd rather talk in. I think we're more effective if we talk in terms of the goal that we seek rather than the source of the power. It gets you into tangles which get you away from working on practical things together that are in your common interest.
Mrs. Davis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for being here. We certainly appreciate it. You know, in our last panel, I think there was actually refocusing in some ways, suggesting that restraint and renewal, I think, was one of the ways it was phrased, that we have so many domestic issues today that perhaps we need to refocus a little bit on that. I'm not necessarily sure that's where the American people are right now. I think they want us to not necessarily retrench. I think they want us to be smarter in what we do, and certainly more strategic, which is what this is all about. What I'm looking for is how do you believe that we mesh what is a concern of people? Certainly the economy, homeland security is a great reminder every time people go to the airport. They're reminded they have to take off their shoes. There's a threat out there. They need to, think about their own security all the time. What is it that, how do you see, I mean, you've tried to, I know you've spoken about this in your papers to a certain extent. I guess I'm looking for maybe a simple way of talking about that. But it seems that we need to work on how we engage people in the military as well as in the civilian sector to look at these issues in a more of a multi-pronged way. And yet, on the other hand, we're not very patient people. And what we need to do in many of the countries, and I'm thinking of Afghanistan right now, is to be slower, to be more measured. And yet we have a threat out there and we want to jump on the threat. Can you help me out with this a little bit in terms of how this discussion can engage the American people better in a way that they can feel comfortable about it.
Yes, ma'am. A couple of quick points. Great powers, at least in the industrial age, tended to get themselves into trouble and to march more quickly off to war when this sort of societal frenzy kicked in and the pace of the march to war accelerated, oftentimes fed by the media, by the yellow press and so forth. And we haven't always done well at this. Spanish-American War comes to mind. It just seems to me that a couple of things are involved. Number one is a measured pace of strategic formulation is very important. One of the interesting things about militaries at the end of wars, militaries at the end of war, as wars wind down, whether they're winners or losers, tend to develop a more sanguine national strategy when they step back, and think about the future as the conflict wears down, before everybody gets too busy trying to charge off to prepare for the next set of threats, most of which are invented. And it just seems to me that as we move into this, I don't know if twilight is the right word, but as we move into stepping down our commitment to Iraq, where just the frenzy of the moment is going to begin to dissipate and fade, and before we march off to the next great scare, the next 2 years in particular, I think, are important to take a measured, circumspect, within the military, to take a measured and circumspect look about what we're going to do next. The professional educational systems are the way to do that. The war colleges and staff colleges are a place to do that. I think officers don't like to spend time reflecting. They're action-oriented, can-do, go-to guys, and they want to go to their next assignment where they can operate very large machines. But I think there comes a time, particularly as wars begin to wear down, when the military establishment, and I would argue the diplomatic establishment, need to step back and be reflective about what they're going to do before someone marches off to a brand new military strategy for the future.
Congresswoman, if I might, I want to start where you began your question, which is, if you're concerned about domestic issues, you're going to be worried about retrenchment, and you want to urge people to be more interested in the need to project our presence overseas. The point I'd make if I was talking to a Rotary Club in your district is that domestic issues are foreign policy issues. They are the issues of the world economy and global capital movements are affecting people in your district in a big way. The issues of energy and the environment are hugely important in your district as domestic issues, but the solutions to those issues lie in international policies. There's no way the United States solves those issues unilaterally. And the traditional way we've thought about these kinds of problems, where we kind of separate the economic issues to the side, you have to have a grand strategy that integrates management of the global economy and management of these energy and environmental issues at the center. But then you're not going to, I think, have any trouble going to your constituents and saying that issues like that matter to them, because I think they totally get it. George Marshall, when he was selling the Marshall Plan, fanned people out all over America to talk to women's clubs, because Marshall and his colleagues thought the women were actually going to determine the stance of families on these issues. Marshall himself went to speak to Cub Scouts in Maryland about the need for reconstruction in Europe. That's the kind of way that they bridge the domestic-foreign divide.
I think there
Ambassador Hunter,
are a couple of other points, though, as I indicated earlier. If we're going to be strong abroad, we have to be strong at home. You can't just say, we're now going to go do something over there without paying attention to our health system. So we have Americans who are able to do things. Education, we've already talked about the role of languages, which is only one part of it. Infrastructure, a whole series of things. And it's for two things. So the American people will say, we have the capacity to do what we have to do, but also we are attending to things here at home. That's why Homeland Security is so important, why having control of our borders is so important, why trade is so important. It's also important, I think, for the leaders to be totally honest with the American people, not to take some foreign event and try to mislead, because we are smart people. I worked in the White House under President Lyndon Johnson, and I know how we got in trouble on that. So it's not a partisan issue. In addition, I've discovered, and you folks will be much better than any of us here because you deal with the public business every day, the American people are prepared to risk blood and treasure if we fulfill three obligations in regard to, let's say, Afghanistan or somewhere else, that it's in the American interest to do it. It comports with American values to do it, and there's some sense that there will be success. If you do the three of those, I think the American people will be willing to be engaged as long as is necessary. You get one of those three wrong, like we did in Somalia, where it was about values but not interests, people are going to say, what are we doing there?
Mr. Conway, comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Setting aside my own discomfort with the phrase grand strategy, which I mentioned previously, that it's a bit imperialistic, and also acknowledging that I'm far better off listening than talking, listening to you rather than you listen to me. I'll pose some questions in a second, but it seems inherent in everything that each of you have said is that there's some grand controlling entity or element or one conductor. You mentioned 100 notes. Without a conductor, that you just get an orchestra warming up. You know, where's the leverage? Where's the ability to force collectively that you know, all the things that you want to talk about? I mean, we're clearly given this the option of getting a coalition of the willing to go do something. If they don't go do it, then we just simply sit back and say, well, then never mind. Since and that doesn't make any sense either. You know, General Scales, you mentioned the pre-insurgency attacks. How do you pull that trigger, and where has that ever worked? And then, you know, Dr. Zelikow, your 5 strategies that a globalized, self-determining world could coexist within. You know, who sets those boundaries and enforces those boundaries and all those rules? I mean, you mentioned it's a 19th and 20th century phenomenon. I think Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great might have had a difference of globalization and self-determination tension there as well. So, and then explain this incredible phenomenon in Dubai and Bahrain and Qatar, where they're just staggering, Kuwait, staggering economic development without the ability to defend that economic development, and how that's not done with the implicit confidence that the United States is not going to let anything stupid happen in that part of the world. So how do you manage all that? I'm a CPA, and I'm typically a little more or less, you know, tinkers to every chance as opposed to kind of the fuzzy grand strategy stuff. So I don't know if I've asked a question or just clouded the water, but I'll shut up because again, I'm clear that I'm better off listening to you 4 than you listening to me.
No, Scott, I think you're absolutely right in characterizing the way that we actually do things overseas as being an incredibly complicated process with a lot of different actors that doesn't go to one conductor. And that's why I think the only way we succeed in that sense is if we have a general idea in the back of the minds of those people who act independently of where it is we're going, so that as they act in their own interests with their own responsibilities and their own incentives, they're sort of moving down the field in roughly the same direction rather than canceling each other out. So that's why I try to suggest that if we get that idea that where we're headed is a world in which we're making progress on both security, economic development, and the idea of representative governments, protection of minority rights, rule of law, the kind of world we'd like to live in, then I think that in each of those little sectors in which you operate, as you're doing your small plan, you can sort of check yourself and say, is this in the right general direction? Who can help me on it? How do I link it together? I found that when I was out as a Pacific commander, I could get allies who were American businessmen operating in Asia. They were ambassadors at embassies. They were heads of international organizations. They were non-governmental organizations. But you could pretty quickly find out who your allies were to move towards the direction that you wanted to go, and you could cut actual deals with them of doing real things. Some of them were big, some of them were little. So I think it's that those general force of magnetism based on your common vision that will align the particles to go the right direction in the sort of messy world that we have.
I don't want to give you the misimpression that we're arguing that there can be one conductor and one overall plan. The Cold War, in which there were two superpowers and was relative clarity, that was an historical aberration. The world is usually a messy place. Now, historically, the United States has done extraordinarily well because we have been prudent stewards of power, and we have stood for things that have, I won't say universal application, but and which an awful lot of people aspire to. We have never gone out to try to grab territory for our own self-aggrandizement. People in Europe and Asia after the end of the Second World War, we came, but then we went home. We didn't try like Germany and the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan had done to try to grab this for ourselves. Some people were surprised that happened, but it set a standard out there that people expect us to do the right thing, and that gives us a tremendous capacity for leadership and for influence. Now, in terms of whether others are going to be with us, I have a very simple rule of thumb. We should try to do things together with others when we can, but do things on our own when we must. I think that gives us a pretty good rule of thumb. We'll very often get others to be with us, but if it's our national self-interest, particularly to protect the country, well, we'll do what we have to do. People understand that, then they're more likely to follow us in things that are going to help us and help them, because we're building to a better definition of what humanity is going to be like in the future.
If I could just add to that, I was in China not too long ago talking to my counterpart at the War College. We got in a discussion one night, and I said, well, what is it about, what is it that's American that you read? And he laughed and he said, well, we read everything you write, we listen to what you say, but most importantly, we watch what you do. You know, the thing about the Americans that we're most sensitive to are your actions rather than your words. And I thought that was significant because one of the turning points in the Cold War, I believe, sir, was when Eisenhower, in the military we have a thing we call a commander's intent. And a commander's intent is when the commander, in this case the president, personalizes what is to be done. You know, what are the tasks that you need to do in order to preserve peace in the world? And Eisenhower gave the commander's intent, I think it was 1954, after he took office, in his famous solarium speech. It wasn't a solarium speech, it was a commander's intent. It was the commander of the nation telling his principal staff, here is what's to be done. And it just seems to me that one of the ways you add clarity in this confusing world in the next administration, whoever's in charge, is what we need is a commander's intent. And there are three elements to the commander's intent, and since I used to teach it, I won't bore you with it, but it's a wonderful way to put clarity into strategy, to translate it not only into tasks, but into a personalized version of what, from the commander-in-chief, of what those tasks need to be. Strip away all the hyperbole and all the grand statements and all the stuff that confuses not only our own population, but the people who we deal with in the world. And perhaps someday in the future, we'll be able to formulate a commander's intent. Call it whatever you want, grand strategy, but some formulation of an intent would be a great way to get started.
Dr. Gingrey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I wonder if you ask the American people, average American, what our grand strategy is as a nation and who sets it, very, very few would have any idea what our grand strategy is. I think they may guess that it's set by the president and the administration. My question, one of my questions is how much, if we do indeed have a grand strategy, and I would like to ask all four of you if you think we have a grand strategy today and what it is. Is it important that the American people know what that grand strategy is, that our high school students understand exactly what our grand strategy is, and how often does that change? Does it change every 4 years when you have a new administration? It seemed that would be a little impractical. And who indeed sets it, and what role do we as members of Congress have in regard to setting a grand strategy? And if our grand strategy is in conflict with other countries such as China and Russia and other would-be powers, how do we mesh that? Do we
Do we change based on what others are doing or what we perceive their grand strategies to be, or do we stay the course? I think maybe Ambassador Hunter touched on that just a minute ago in his remarks, that we should have a strategy that we don't vary because of what other people are doing, other countries are doing. So maybe that's enough a commentary that you can spend some time answering those questions or thoughts. Thank you.
Congressman, if I could start at this end of the table, I do not think we have such a grand strategy today. If you have a grand strategy that's like the handful of large policies that have succeeded in the past that survive the oscillations of elections and parties, that's precisely the point, is to provide concerted action that then, so that the President and the Congress both understand it and sharing overlapping powers are moving in a common direction. We don't have that today. If it shifts every 4 years, it's not a durable grand strategy. If it's not with the Congress, it's not a grand strategy at all, because you won't get concerted action. The elements then, though, are it has to be something that people can understand very clearly because it's about a subject they get, and it's about a subject that a lot of foreign governments and foreign countries get too. So when I suggested, for example, a rally point of calling for an open, civilized world and then laying out what that meant, the agenda that I outlined is an agenda that a lot of other people in the world care about and want. So since they want that, they want those forces to be mastered, they're going to have to then look to who is going to provide leadership in mastering those forces. And whatever the problems the United States has, there is no country that can step forward right now to supplant that role. So they want action, and they know we are central to getting that action. And if we can provide a framework in which we explain why the dozen things we're doing are actually moving towards a kind of world Americans want for their children, I think you can rally people across party lines. We'll then still have lots of arguments about how best to achieve those goals, and that's natural. But we might be able to reestablish a degree of consensus that I think right now is lacking.
You know, not to repeat, but I think we should not believe that suddenly the world is going to be a much better place without an awful lot of effort. There will still be conflict. There will still be competitions for power. There still will be societies out there that do not wish us well. We see it today. We'd like to see it in the past. Our basic requirements as a nation are to provide the security, the prosperity, the independence, and the well-being of the country and of the American people. Now, with American leadership and American ideals and the kinds of ways we express our interests, we are likely to find a lot of receptivity in a lot of parts of the world. We're not going to find it with everybody. We see a number of states today and non-state actors who wish us ill, both because they want power for themselves and some of them just don't like our way of life. So, but the vast majority are going to be responsive to the leadership of the United States. Now, what you're touching on, I think it has two special qualities. One is education. One of the things I most worry about in the American state, American nation today, is the collapse of civic education in our schools. You'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, at how few people understand, younger people, and even some of the basic history of this country. We just don't teach it to the degree we used to, and I think we have to get onto that in a very big way. As to who will create, organize this grand strategy, this hearing is part of it. As I said before, if the Congress is not involved, the people are not involved, you don't have one. You don't have a basic sense of where the American people are prepared to go, either at home and abroad. And that's why I think that for the Congress not to be involved would be a gross loss to the nation.
Mr. Jones for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And like Mr. Conway said, I probably could listen to you and have no questions, just try to think about what you've been sharing with us. But I do want to go in a little direction because I'm sitting here listening. I missed most of your presentations. I did look through some of your written report, but your answer to Ms. Davis and some of my colleagues, are we as a nation getting to the point that if we do not, as some of you have said, start taking care of things within this nation, such as health care, infrastructure, are we getting to a point that we're not going to be able to have the international influence? Because I think about the Chinese, which many of you have mentioned. They have to know that we owe China $448 billion. Those leadership, military and non-military, they know that America is borrowing money from China to pay its bills. So are we losing what influence we could have with other nations because they know that we can't even take care of our own situation? And this does impact on our military. Our military is as stressed as it's ever been. The equipment, we had testimony from Secretary Wynn, who's not there any longer, saying that we are putting projects behind, putting them on the back burner because we don't have the money to fund everything at this particular time. So I guess my question to you, do we need to take a period of time under the leadership of a new president or maybe two new presidents over the next 7 to 8 years and stop trying to say to certain parts of the country, of the world, that we're there to help save you, we're there to help make you better when we can't even fix our own problems? Do the nations that are more sophisticated from a governmental standpoint, do they see us as one of those parts of history that we're at a point that there might not be a return as a great nation if we don't get serious about what's happening within this country?
If I could just make a shot, I think you hit on something very important, sir. We live in an era where global communications flies around the world at an unprecedented rate, and that someone with a transistor radio or small television and some, native hut in Southwest Asia is almost as much on current events as those of us sitting in this room. So perception is important here. How people perceive us is important. It's not just $448 billion worth of debt, but it's the subjective opinion that people have of the American people that has enormous power. I mean, it can be translated into power. So if eventually the day comes when you want to, say, for instance, build a coalition or bring in partners for a particular threatened region of the world, the easiest way to do that is to do the condition setting, if you will, among folks in different parts of the world, such that when we show up, the perception of who we are is perhaps different than it is today. And I think, and that's something that you can't do overnight, and you can't do with a TV ad. It's going to take a generation in some ways to change those perceptions. And I don't believe it's necessarily related to, to debt. I think it's related to moral debt, not fiscal debt. And if we can't turn that around very quickly, and oh, by the way, it's not just with the ruling elites of the world. It's with, the Arab street or the common man in Beijing. It's what he or she thinks about the United States. It's so important. If we can't occupy the moral high ground, we can't own it in some way, so the rest of the world is pushing on an open door. When we try to impose our will on other parts of the world, we're going to find ourselves in great trouble.
I think people are less worried about whether we are getting our economic house in order, provided we have the capacity to do things, plus what the General just said, the moral high ground for the United States. We have thousands and thousands of ambassadors. Some of them are in the military, who go out and do things in individual villages and communities and the like, all over the place. In fact, the U.S. military, in terms of integrating instruments of power and influence, took the lead and are now looking for other parts of the government to do things because this isn't what the military should have to do, even though they're awfully good at it. We have thousands and thousands of people in non-governmental organizations who are the face of America. The private sector, to a great extent, more people in the world will see somebody from the private sector rather than somebody from the government, civilian and military. And this is a fantastic asset. Meanwhile, one of the great strengths of this country, when people talk about are we in decline, et cetera, I don't think that's true. The American ship of state has an amazing keel, and we can tip over an awful long way, but we tip back again. And right now, this nation is tipping back again in a new era, I believe, of strength and purpose across the country, across the political parties, and I think, to use that old hackneyed expression, some of our best days are still ahead of us.
You're right.
No foreign group that I talk to, leadership, thinker, influential, thinks that the United States is in some sort of inexorable decline and is looking beyond us to do something else. I think we are more worried about our problems than foreigners are, and I think that's absolutely right, because we know them better. We're the ones who are going to have to fix them.
Just real quick, but if you move into that realm of a perception of decline, I think of conditions after 1972-73, or actually after the fall of Saigon, that creates periods of strategic vulnerability and heightens the probability of miscalculation on the part of those. I mean, I'm not saying al-Qaeda is not trying to do mischief right now, but al-Qaeda's ability to garner assets and to garner his own coalition together to take us on increases when we go through periods of our own sense of vulnerability. That led to the Maya Gez incident, and I could go on and on. You see what I'm, so it's perception management is important, I think, as we move through this war and into the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I wanted to ask General Scales if you would take a minute and amplify a little bit on your comment about orienting around embassies.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think with apologies to Admiral Blair, I think...
Give me a chance to rebut, then I'll...
Oh, absolutely.
I'm the referee in these two military.
I think there's a tendency always to view power or the distribution of power in the world as going through a military chain of command. So our instinct, or again, back to perceptions, oftentimes from the other end, the perception is, oh boy, here it comes. There's a perception of a military solution to a regional problem. And to I forget who the member asked me about pre-insurgencies. The way you keep the nation safe in the early phases of budding trouble in the world, I believe, is through the country team, through the ambassador, through the defense attaché, and through this sort of proto-alliance, if that's the right word, this early emerging alliance where the ambassador and the defense attaché is in charge. A pre-insurgency would be the ability in some threatened state that either has a poor military or has no military to, through a very deliberate process, to begin training up, to begin acculturating, and to begin very, very carefully sort of passing on our own national and cultural values to an emerging state, such that when the insurgency does somehow begin to get more serious, then the process of reacting to it is done in a more deliberate, cautious, collegial way, rather than having the airborne or the Marines suddenly show up on someone's doorstep ready to do something that perhaps may not agree with the world's perception of what should be done.
Admiral Blair, did you have any comments on?
No, I recognize the underlying problem that General Scales is talking about, but just to throw a small organizational solution like organize around an ambassador is just doesn't do justice to the complexity of the problem. Ambassadors have country responsibilities, not a regional point of view. Many of the sorts of human skills and also resources and technical skills require decisions that go across individual countries into regional approaches, and we have to come up with a matrix collaborative approach that bring to bear both military and, as I said, non-military governmental and non-governmental tools to bear on the sorts of both problems and opportunities that we have in the world, and I just think it's a much more complicated problem than simply assigning troops in a country to an ambassador.
Ambassador Hunter?
Well, in conflict situations like Iraq and Afghanistan, or even Bosnia and Kosovo before that, we've done best when there's been a strong country team in which everybody's pulling in the same direction. It's less a matter of who's going to be in charge, even though ultimately an ambassador works directly for the president, than the fact that they know how to work together and they have the will to do that. And we've done much better in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We've had that kind of team as elsewhere. Let me tell you about 4 programs that are very cheap that buy us an awful lot. The IMET program has been one of the most cost-effective things this country's done, creating relationships with militaries, which are the gold standard when we want to get involved. Fulbrights, leader grants. I would want to see the United States Information Agency again created as a separate organization. It really works. One of the things we're learning about transformation is it is very important to have people abroad creating relationships, not trying to parachute them in just when there's a crisis. Maybe that's more expensive in the short term. It pays off in the long term. And one other thing which applies, I think, directly to Iraq and Afghanistan, which the military gentleman here can have a particular view on. We tend to bring folks in for 6 months, 12 months, 15 months, and then they leave. The relationships they have built with the locals then disappear, and you have to start over again. Now, you have to rotate people. You have to, for a whole variety of reasons. But there are a lot of cadres and other ancillary folks and non-military who really need to be there for long tours to build on these relationships so they don't just disappear when the 101st, let's say, is replaced by the Marines in the northwest part of Iraq, and they have to start over again. We need to find a way so these relationships will be evergreen over time. And given the way Americans behave in country, these are fantastic resources.
Let me just, I need one rebut for the Admiral. I didn't mean for the ambassador to be commanding troops. But what I meant was that the pre-insurgency phase of a relationship with a nation under stress is something that needs to be managed by the company team. It's just better to do it earlier rather than wait for the insurgency to suddenly inflame a country and then suddenly have to react to it rather than setting conditions before that happens.
Dr. Zelikow, you've been trying to get word in.
I should say General Scales' suggestion is going, his heart is in the right place, but actually we're trying to regionalize the country team right now, not fragment it down to the country level. Take, for example, sub-Saharan Africa. We need to actually regionalize the State Department's projection of civilian power on a regional basis. You can't handle the problems of the Great Lakes region of Africa purely on a country team by country team basis. Or if I was to switch over to counterterrorism in Southeast Asia, pre-insurgency, if I carve that up by Thailand, Southern Philippines, Indonesia, the way we've tried to do is create regional field teams in which we actually pool our resources, CIA, military, a lot of other resources, to work what is in essence a regional problem in Southeast Asia for countering terrorism. If you took the example of Afghanistan, you can't handle the problem of Afghanistan without some way of extending outward to Pakistan. Same goes for Iraq when you think about the surrounding region, Turkey, Iran, other things. My point is that I think the country team model is the right model of civil-military intel cooperation, and I praise that, but we actually need to try to regionalize that model where we need to in order to tackle the issues.
Ambassador Hunter, I have to share with you, years ago I worked at a Catholic mission hospital in West Africa, and one day one of the nuns said to me, she said, the priests aren't really very helpful. They only last out here 35 or 40 years. Nuns had more staying power than that.
Mr. Chairman, I think you need to do something about that and have them stay a whole career.
Mr. Aiken.
Different, little less philosophical question. I was actually amazed that there were apparently a fair number of Europeans, probably 20% of America, that believe that we went into Iraq to steal their oil. I mean, I think there's still probably a few people who believe that, but the fact that we have been there now, at least, knock on wood, successfully, and if we close out and leave a self-governing state behind, does that buy us a lot of capital in a world sense, at least to give us some immunization from? I mean, I gather for a number of years here in Europe, everybody was convinced those bad Americans are just stealing those guys' oil. What do you think about that?
Well, since I've worked on Iraq some over the last few years, the Iraqis are doing very well off their oil.
Sure.
And we're not going to end up stealing their oil. The question is actually whether or not we help them gain the benefit of their own resources, as we did in the case of Saudi Arabia. No one says that America now owns Saudi Arabia's oil, but Texans basically help the Saudis find the way to develop their own resources to its full potential, and the Saudis know this perfectly well. There is a little bit of a backlash that I'm worried about, in which people are so paranoid about the accusation that we're stealing their oil that we think it's actually in America's interest for Gazprom to have all those rights.
We have a good test that you can point to. 1991, we were in Kuwait. We could have seized the Saudi fields and the Kuwaiti fields and kept them forever. A lot of people thought we were going to do that, and we left. That bought us an awful lot of money in the bank of influence. I remember once when we had a military exercise in Egypt, and the Air Force wanted to stay because there was another one coming, and I made them leave, the spec under Carter. And then when President Sadat came to see the President of the United States, he said, the fact that you left was more important than the fact that you came. You can come anytime. People understand the United States will help out, create victory, give people opportunities, and then go home.
I think regardless of what the conditions are, Mr. Aiken, there's no question that the radical insurgents are going to view us leaving as their victory. I'm sorry, that's just the way wars are and the way conflicts are. But the rest of the world, the Europeans and regional states in particular, will breathe, as Ambassador Hunter said, an enormous sigh of relief that we are adhering to our pattern of behavior, as Bob said, a pattern of behavior that we've established going all the way back to Greece in 1948-49. That's just the way we act. That's how the American military, as advisor groups, have acted in the past. El Salvador is another example. We left Panama. So we do have a track record which is pretty good. We also left Saudi Arabia. We have a track record which is pretty good of when things get to the point where stability is reasonable, then we pull out. And I think as Bob said, exactly right. Pulling out sometimes is just as important as going in.
But let's not break our arms patting ourselves on the back here. The reason that we are, one of the fundamental reasons that we are involved as heavily as we are in the Middle East is that's where the oil is. That doesn't mean that we are have U.S. troops around oil fields and are shipping it directly into American cars, but a major reason, one of two in which we're there, is that that's where the world's oil supply is, and we depend on that to the tune of 60 or 70% of the imports to run our cars and vehicles around. So I think that it is an issue as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and what do we do about it. I personally think that's a bad thing. We've militarized our policy in that region. It's based on making sure that there's access to oil at a fair price, and that has all sorts of toxic side effects, which we are dealing with in terms of the anti-American insurgency that's running there. So I think that our approach to that region, number one, needs to be to cut down the oil intensity of our economy by a great deal. We can't become oil independent, but we can certainly spend import a heck of a lot less oil for every dollar of GDP that we generate, as we did in the 1970s after the first oil crisis. I think we can be a lot more deft in combining non-military as well as military things that we do in that region, so that we get the benefits of being able to have a favorable relationship there and don't get all the toxic side effects of setting up targets who can be portrayed as crusaders and be accused of stealing the oil and get the Arab Street working against us. So I think that there's work to be done on that score, not to simply congratulate ourselves that we leave after exercises in Egypt.
Just if I could finish that thought. It does seem to me that there is a difference. One of the things we said about why do we go to World War I, that there is a national interest. Two, that the cause is a worthy cause and a chance to win. That's pretty good. Three to start with. Certainly we had a national interest in keeping the Middle East from melting down, and also from all sorts of nukes going off there. But that said, we're not there to steal their oil. We're there to stabilize the region, and they can reap the benefits of their own oil. It seems like I understand what you're saying, and certainly I agree, and been voting for 8 years to get us off of our dependence on Middle Eastern oil. But thus said, we still did not steal their oil and never had the intent of stealing their oil and will not steal their oil. It seems to me that that's a fairly big point, in that apparently a whole lot of the world thought that's what we were going to do.
Mr. Aiken, if I could get tactical on you for a moment. When I was in Iraq in November, one of the things that impressed me most is the quality of strategic perception management that's gone into the U.S. command in doing exactly what you suggest. One of the things that struck me was I went into a very large headquarters to the information operations cell, and 2/3 of the people in that cell, not only were they Iraqis, but they were Iraqis from the Iraqi media. That's a huge sea change from 2 or 3 years ago. Now, some of the things that they report locally in their own media are not terribly complimentary to us. But the grand scheme of it, the perception generally of the population has shifted enormously because of what Dave Petraeus and others have done over there to try to open up's not the right word, to try to give the Iraqis an opportunity to dig into our own motives to the degree that they can without sacrificing security. And so the lesson to take into the grand strategy of the future, I think, is to put that in a bottle in some way, to find instruments that will allow us to be open to the global media in a way that we've never done before, again, without violating some of the tenets of national security.
Mr. Conaway for 5 minutes.
Well, I won't use the 5 minutes other than to, Dr. Zelikow, are you on record somewhere in 1999, 2000 of wanting to intervene militarily in Afghanistan? You mentioned that you perceive them as a imminent threat well in advance of the direct attack. Is that something you developed now in hindsight, or were you ahead of the curve on record in that time frame of actually wanting military intervention?
Well, what I did do is I joined a group that published an article at the end of 1998 in Foreign Affairs called Catastrophic Terrorism, in which I argued that that should now come into the foreground as the most dangerous threat to the United States. It used the World Trade scenario just to show how America would be divided into a before and after if we suffered such an attack. But I did not publicly call for the United States to use military action in Afghanistan in that article. I was trying to put that threat front and center because I thought that was then very severe. I actually think the evident failure of our reactions to the 1998 attacks as evidence after the Cole attack in October 2000, I think made it clear at that point that it was just a matter of time before they were just going to keep hitting until they got a really big strike. And nothing we were doing was interfering with their operational effectiveness. But I didn't have a chance to really exhume the archives of how our government had thought about that problem until I directed the 9/11 Commission. I would say that the observation I made about the fact that that was an imminent threat before 9/11 and that we needed to be ahead of the curve in responding to it, and it's a bipartisan remark that I think would be shared by all the commissioners who looked at that material in both parties on the commission.
I guess the problem is knowing today what's today's imminent threat, and that's what everybody struggles with. As historians, it's a lot easier looking backwards than forwards, and the decision makers today and the guys who have to make those hard decisions are obviously keenly interested in doing it right. But it isn't any easier today than it was in August of 2001 to figure out who's going to throw the next punch.
Well, the paradox that the Commission described in its report is that once you've been hit catastrophically, you have no trouble rallying a popular consensus to deal with it. But of course, at that point, thousands of Americans are dead and hundreds of billions of dollars have been lost. If you want to get ahead of that curve, you're going to do things in which you're going to have to go on judgments, and you're not going to have the same kind of unity behind you. That's the paradox, is once the threat is manifest to all, it's manifest to all. And so then the issue is, so for example, do you bother about Hitler when he marches into the Rhineland in 1936? Do you bother about Czechoslovakia in 1938 when, Czech Sudetenland, is that really worth, do you bother about Manchuria in 1931 and 1932 when the Japanese start moving south of the Great Wall, out of Manchuria? The point is, if you want to head these things off before they become catastrophic, then you have to make tough calls that will seem disproportionate to a lot of people. Now, in the case of 9/11, you're actually talking about an enemy that had already attacked us twice in a long-range international operation. So this was not a threat that was purely speculative. And it seemed to me the case was pretty strong, certainly after the Cole attack, if not before.
Congressman, let me add something, because this gets directly to the problem of trying to anticipate catastrophic events, or to use a kind of term the military often uses, the black swan, that is something that's just not supposed to happen. As I indicated earlier, one of the things we really face today is asymmetrical warfare. People who say we cannot attack the Americans in a major way in the homeland or even troops abroad, but what we can do is try to increase the number of casualties there are so that it can weaken the American will, or we can try to use a relatively inexpensive weapon against an expensive weapon, to use an IED against an armored personnel carrier, that sort of thing, so that the economics work on that. The problem we face is that the leverage effect of a relatively minor terrorist attack in this country can be immense on the American people. It's one reason we spend so much time and effort on homeland security, on airport security, and the like. It's also why we have tried to, as a nation, to create a hierarchy of concerns. As the President said, it's the marriage of terrorism with high technology is what we most have to worry about. So the number one requirement is to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of terrorists, weaponizable biologicals, then radiological, and then chemical, or something that they can do which will either have a huge shock effect in this country, or that could disrupt some kind of important economic node. To eliminate all terrorism is going to be impossible. We could clamp down totally in this country. We could prevent anybody from coming here. We could end civil liberties and all of that, and still somebody's going to be able to do something to us. So we have to create this hierarchy of protective measures and active measures to try to get at as much potential terrorism as possible, to keep the weapons that they could most use against it out of their hands, and to help the American people and others understand we're going to get much of it, but we cannot promise a risk-free environment. And I think people understand that and are prepared to go with the things we most have to do to protect our nation.
That might fall into a grand strategy.
Dr. Gingrich for 5 minutes.
Apparently I did use my 5 minutes.
You did. That's all right.
The commentary in regard to preemptive strategy rather than a containment strategy is something I'd like for you to touch on, because particularly in regard to Iran and their desire to have they say nuclear power, but we say nuclear weapon. And of course, if we allow them to do that, then containing yet another country, somewhat unfriendly country, with nuclear weapon, I think is a bad thing. So preemptive strategy, I think, probably is a good thing in certain instances. I do want to ask about the idea of our energy policy and what we're pushing for in regard to, I think Admiral Blair mentioned a little bit about, not patting ourselves on the back too much in regard to the Middle East and what we've done and why we did it. But do you see, any of you see our energy policy as we go forward in the future as being part of, if not maybe a backdrop, but a significant part of a grand strategy as we go forward in the future?
I said so explicitly in my testimony, Congressman. I described, I agree, by the way, with what Admiral Blair said about this a few moments ago. I'd add, by the way, that the importation of oil accounts for half of our net current account deficit and is the single most important reason for the continuing indebtedness of the United States. Even while we have a low dollar and our export conditions are fundamentally good, we're not getting the benefit of that because of the scale of our oil imports. It's the single biggest drain on the American economy right now. So I think that a five-part agenda for what global forces do you have to manage, to be able to offer some hope that we can manage these forces cooperatively in the world. One of those 5 agenda items is energy and the environment and reducing the dependence on oil and dirty coal.
I think we have to be candid about this. Even if we could get our own dependence down, the industrialized world is going to depend upon Middle East energy. That includes countries that we relate to very dearly, including the Europeans. It can't be done in short of 100 years or something like that. So we have no choice but to try with others to ensure that energy resources from the Middle East will continue to flow. I know there are a lot of ways of looking at that, lots of threats, et cetera, one has to work on. At the same time, we will be in a much better position if we do, as a fundamental commitment, it's not telling anybody anything new, to try to reduce American dependence on the outside world. Part of that is finding other sources of hydrocarbons, and a lot of it is finding alternative energy, and a lot of it is conservation. Now, you're in the bad position that it's very difficult for you to go to your constituents and say, we have to do this kind of thing, and you have to sacrifice today. When people say, I can understand a $4 a gallon gasoline, get that down, I'm not going to worry anymore. One of the fundamental things we have to do is, as a nation, and you folks are got the trouble, is to collapse the political horizon of what people support to meet the strategic requirement. So I would say energy has to be one of the 3 or 4 critical items of any grand strategy.
I think, Congressman Gingrey, that the way oil deposits were put in the world and the effect they have now had to have been done by somebody with a sense of humor. I mean, they are in the worst places with the most unstable governments, violent social forces at work, and yet that's where they are. And what really worries me in the future is that a Western Africa and a Central Asia, which are the areas of most hydrocarbon deposits behind the Middle East, in which we're in the same sort of situation that we are now in the Middle East. Lots of troops deployed, unstable governments, having to cut deals with governments that we don't really much like, being targets when we're out there, paying a lot of money to people who can jam it up our nose in other ways. And so I think that we need to work very much on the demand side in this country. We have to actively do things that will ensure that we get the energy that we do need from places that put us in a less difficult position from using our armed forces and other tools of power. Everything from importing Brazilian sugar-based ethanol, which could be a partial solution. It's just fine if we send money to Brazil as opposed to other places. That we get on with a proper clean coal project so that we can electrify the transportation sector and not completely depend upon oil. It's a multi-part process that we've got to pursue with an underlying national security rationale of not sending our troops over as the last resort in places that we haven't solved by, number one, curbing our activities at home, and number two, being more clever about the way we use our power overseas.
I have one final question I wanted to ask, and then we'll let Mr. Aiken and Dr. Gingrey, any final comments they want to make. Dr. Zelikow, I wanted you to amplify, if you would, on your comment about, how did you phrase it, I urge the committee to dig more deeply into the core problem, which is a lack of clarity about the problem itself, lack of clarity about the character of this moment in world history. Would you just amplify on that for me, please? Yes. And then anybody else that wants to comment on, anybody wants to critique what Dr. Zelikow says.
The whole notion of a grand strategy is we're trying to talk about our purpose in the world in a way that we think will resonate with a lot of people in the rest of the world. So if we're going to have a sense of purpose, that has to be oriented to some observation and diagnosis of what's the overarching condition that a lot of Americans and a lot of other people in the world care about. You have to have some observation about the character of the moment in world history. In the years immediately after World War II, for example, there was actually a big argument in the United States about what we should care about. For example, Eleanor Roosevelt and Sumner Welles and others said we ought to be concerned with the remnants of fascism, Franco's Spain, remnants of fascism in Latin America. A number of Republicans argued that we ought to turn aside from Europe and really concentrate on the future of East Asia, that that's where really the future of the world is going to be determined, and we ought to cut back our commitments in Europe and redouble our commitments in Asia and actually intervene in the Chinese Civil War. So then there was a third school which said that the dominant problem at this moment in world history is the encroachment of international communism as led by the Soviet Union and the symbolic effect on that on people's hopes for whether we will live in a free world or not, and that the key theater for engaging that threat is in Europe, and therefore the key focus of your grand strategy of containment in the first instance is going to have to be on European recovery. So there was an argument that went on about that. It went on for a couple of years, and then was definitively resolved in 1947, and then they took it to the American people. Although really the axioms of containment versus, say, rollback after the outbreak of the Korean War was not settled until the Eisenhower administration, and really settled that in as a firm grand strategy in 1953. Now, the moment in history that I think we're at right now is one in which, for the first time, we now have full globalization. It's reminiscent of what we had at the beginning of the 20th century, but then we didn't have the engagement of China and India in the world economy in the scale we have it now, and the velocity of movement of energy and money and ideas and people, although there was enormous movements of people back then in the tens of millions, and a lot of immigration issues too. So if that era of full globalization is so important, by the way, people in India get that, people in China get that, it's not a mystery. The reaction to that, though, is a huge push for self-determination, is I'm going to react against the global forces that are trying to reshape my community and that I think threaten me, whether it's the immigrants coming into my community or the goods you're trying to sell that undercut my goods. It manifests itself in 100 different ways, a lot of them cultural. And so that's the tension you have to manage. And then to manage that tension, you've got to convince people that nations in the world can get together and constructively manage these colossal global forces on an unprecedented scale. Because if they think that you can't manage them cooperatively, they will fort up. Fortification almost as a metaphor for lots of different ways in which people will fort up. And so there's an agenda then of how do we reassure people that we're getting a handle on these enormous global forces, and I talk about them in especially 5 items on an agenda. I mean, just to give you an example of the diffusion of ultra-hazardous technologies, not just nuclear energy, which I think is essential, but say new technologies for genetic manipulation, or nanotechnologies, which I think we'll hear more about in coming years, and the dangers that they could pose. If people think that the world's not going to manage these forces, they're going to react to that in ways that I think will be toxic and extremely dangerous, and which brought civilization to the very precipice of destruction during the 20th century. We could find ourselves in a pattern like that again. So I start with the observation that the clarity about the problem is important, because if you agree that the core problem is the tension between globalization and self-determination, the agenda that flows from that is an agenda which I call an agenda for an open, civilized world, in my essay with Ernie May. And then the policy agenda that goes with that is one in which you convince ordinary people that these unprecedented man-made forces are being constructively managed through cooperation. Because if you don't convince them of that, they're going to try to manage them in other ways.
Thank you.
If I could just, real quick, the thing that struck me from what my colleague just said, going back 100 years ago, if you were to read the press at the time and look at the middle and upper middle classes, there was a sense through industrialization, this sense of well-being, that the world was never in a better state than it was in 1908. Well, there were war clouds, obviously, in South Africa and Manchuria, but those were worlds away, and Europeans and Americans felt really good about themselves in 1908, and no one would have thought that Mons and Le Cateau and the execution of assassination of Franz Ferdinand would ever happen. And so I guess if I could leave with something, it's always a caution, and I'm a perennial pessimist because I'm a soldier, but there's always this idea that any type of global any type of global clockwork mechanism is always fragile. And all it takes is misperception, amplified by a global media, small minorities, your point about the anarchists, small minorities who inflame and accelerate and expand global fear that could lead to something that over the long term could be catastrophic. That's why I talk so much about pre-insurgency and about setting conditions for regional stability is the best way to offset something catastrophic from happening.
Mr. Aiken, any final comments?
I could probably stay all day. I just wanted to compliment the witnesses. I think that there's a real synergism in a way because all of your perspectives together really created a tremendously helpful perspective for those of us that have had the treat to be able to be here today. So thank you. Thank you for the many ways that you've served our country, and I really appreciate you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Let me give you all an invitation as a formal question for the record. If you have anything you'd like to add, clarify, augment, if you will get it to the staff in a timely way, we will make it part of this record. Thank you all very, very much for being here. Thank you for your service. We're adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
Man. Okay. It was a good player.